about taking a shower. Oh, of course. And they worry about me. Don't we do?
All right, take your seats. We'll get started.
Nice.
It's a joy to know that Dr. Stedman has a front row seat for the dementia lecture. That's good. And yeah, very good, Dr. Stedman. Very good. You didn't get lost on the way here? You found your keys? No one stole your wallet? Well, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Donald Royall, our Grand Round speaker this afternoon. Dr. Donald Royall is an Aggie, graduated from Texas A&M. Went to medical school at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. After that, went on to Johns Hopkins for an internal medicine residency, did internal medicine for 3 years, finished internal medicine, and then said, I think I'll do psychiatry. So then he did another 3 years of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, and after completing his residency there, he joined our faculty and has been our faculty ever since. Dr. Royall is our division chief for aging and geriatric psychiatry. On a personal note, I don't know that any clinician in our department has done more to inspire the scholarly work of residents. I think Dr. Royall has mentored more residents in research efforts than any other faculty that I know of. Also, on a personal note, Dr. Don Royall is the man who inspired me to smoke my own briskets. Those of you that have been to my house parties can thank him for that. So all in all, please join me in welcoming our Grand Round speaker, Dr. Don Royall.
Okay, well, as Dr. Stedman will attest, the Aggies taught me just about everything I need to know about dementia. And it's all been downhill from there. I've just been trying to remember what it was they were trying to tell me. Anyway, I'm going to take you full circle today from the very origins of cognitive assessment back to where I think we ought to be looking for dementia case finding. And I don't work much with drug companies, and what work I've done has nothing to do with this. But I do have some intellectual property skin in the game, so I thought I'd put those out for you. Anyway, I talked on this subject in Grand Rounds in 2011, and since then I've published all of these papers on this topic, mostly from secondary data analyses of existing data. And the same couple of years, 3 years, I've submitted, I think, 8 grant proposals on this topic, and only one has been funded. So while I don't think you'll get rich doing this kind of work, I do think that it would be a great way to jumpstart a young career, to be following the trail that I'm blazing here, which is actually pretty easy to do, and it's not rocket science, although it might be new to some of you. And so I'm going to have to introduce you with a little primer on structural equation modeling and latent variables. But I think that's the key to this new appreciation I've developed for dementia, what it is and how we might approach it. And the road to this goes through history, through Spearman's concept of G, or general intelligence, which he first developed at the very debut of psychology. And his seminal paper was published in the American Journal of Psychology in 1904. And I went back and dug that paper up and read it, and this guy is way ahead of his time. He had a completely empirical vision of what intelligence is, not the more or less romantic notion that we have now, that it means you're smart. And I want to show you how his mathematical approach to intelligence and the definition of intelligence really doesn't map well onto our conceptualization of what we think intelligence is or means or of right ought to be. And then from Spearman's G, I've been able to extract this thing, D, which is a a latent variable that can serve as a phenotype for dementia case finding. And I'll show you a lot about that. Spearman's G had a property he described called G's indifference to its indicators. General intelligence is observable in every cognitive operation. And he meant that literally, down to sensory functions. So he could distinguish intelligence within strictly sensory tasks. And that's how deep in the brain intelligence must go. So in a world where we kind of imagine that dementia is related to memory and there's memory centers and we ruminate about the hippocampus, you have to appreciate how the hippocampus and its pathology can have nothing to do with general intelligence, because intelligence is part of every cognitive operation known, all the way down to sensory tasks. And that's what Spearman's talking about, and D is a piece of that. So that has tremendous implications, not only for dementia case finding, but for how psychometrically we approach dementia and what the advantages and disadvantages are. And I think it also constrains the biology of dementia. And so that's interesting. And from D, using it as a phenotype, we can create biomarker models of these biomarkers. And I think for the first time we can approach understanding the biomarkers of dementia itself in the abstract, independently of maybe the relatively superficial disease-specific biomarkers that may or may not be related to dementia. So you should understand that when it comes to Alzheimer's, we worry about plaques and tangles all the time, and people are trying to study them and develop drugs that might delay their development or wash them away. But 89% of brains in the Honolulu Asia Aging Study have Alzheimer's pathology in the hippocampus, and only 3% of them are demented. So you can disentangle Alzheimer's lesions from dementing lesions. They're not necessarily the same thing. And this approach is going to help you do that. So structural equation models and Spearman's G. So in structural equation models, sound fancy, but they're not rocket science. They're very approachable through certain software applications. And I'm not a programmer. I'm a little dyslexic. I have trouble with SAS. But this is very graphical, and that's what I appreciate about it. And so basically, you draw the model, and behind the scenes, the software is programming it for you. And basically, in this notation, an observed variable is a square. So a memory test would look like this in the model, right? And psychologists worry a lot about measurement error. All psychometric measures are prone to measurement error, which you know as educational bias or cultural bias or translation bias. There's all sorts of biases inherent to trying to do cognitive testing. And it gets down into, does the examiner know how to give this test? In my clinic, we have medical students giving the exit, the mini-mental, and it's the first time they ever saw them, and they just go straight into the patient encounter and do the testing, on which we kind of think about what's going on with the patient. So there's got to be measurement error there. So to get around that, they'll do a battery. And so maybe they'll give you 3 memory tests, or 3 items on a survey assessing the same thing from different directions. Because every one of them is prone to measurement error, but they share something. And what they share is not measured directly. Your battery is these 3 tests. But what you're trying to measure is memory, right? And because this is not directly observed, it's called a latent variable, and it's essentially a factor, right? So this is a factor. Spearman invented factor analysis to study cognition. So when we do factor analyses these days, Spearman sat down one day and invented that in order to do what he wanted to do with cognitive testing. And he demonstrated the importance of latent variables that you cannot measure directly, but are inferred by the variance shared across any battery of cognitive assessments. And in structural equation models, there's one more little gimmick here. They force you to account for 100% of the variance. So here we've said we got 3 memory tests. They share something called memory, and memory is related to each of these through these, they're called factor loadings here. But they don't explain all the variance in these three tests, so you have to put that in. And so this becomes error. This is what these three tests don't share with each other. And whatever it is they don't share, it is memory, because they're all memory tests, right? So this approach allows you to extract a relatively error-free construct. The latent variable is free of measurement error. Linguistic bias, cultural bias, educational bias, all sorts of bias, because they are unique to the individual measures and not shared across all of them. So to the extent that the measurement error is unique to an individual test, it can't get down into the latent constructs. And while I'm not saying the latent constructs are 100% measurement error free, they're pretty close to that goal. And so they're much more reliable and probably accurate measures of what's really going on in a cognitive battery than looking at the observed numbers, which is, without a calculator or a computer, what we're limited to. We look at the mini-mental score. We don't look at the fraction of its variance related specifically to dementia and ignore the fraction in the mini-mental score that has nothing to do with that, but has to do with cultural, linguistic, or educational bias. So that's a limitation. And this is called a basic measurement model, and this is its construction, and it's comparable to a factor, and it's considered error-free. And of course, this measurement model might have 3 memory tests, but that's not what we do in clinic. If you came to my clinic, it would look like this. We're going to give you a memory test, an executive test, a clot drawing test, a nonverbal test. What the hell do they share if you built this model? And what they share is Spearman's G, general intelligence. Intelligence raises all boats. It doesn't matter what cognitive operation you're looking at. The more intelligent someone is, then the higher their performance will be across every test you happen to care to give to them. And so some of the variance in every observed measure is attributable to something that you don't think you're measuring, which is G. And G is a piece of every cognitive assessment, so you can't escape it. So Spearman's general intelligence factor, he described it in 1904. It's the common variance across measures. More modern investigators have tried to associate it with executive function and frontal pathology. I'm not sure exactly how much I believe that, but we'll see. Here's Spearman. So his career spanned the early part of the 20th century. His paper coming out in 1904 was in, I think, the 14th volume of the Journal of Psychology, the American Journal of Psychology. It was at the very beginning of psychology as an enterprise, when a lot of things that we take for granted were not really well articulated yet. So I think he was way ahead of his time. And here's a modern conceptualization of what G might represent. Remember, it's a latent variable, so it's a circle, right? So you have observed measures all over here. This is some humongous battery. And each of these is a measurement model. You have 3 measures related to it's called a domain-specific latent variable. So this might be memory, language, executive function, the things we think of. But what this is trying to remind you is that all of them are pieces of the big G back here. So it's part of every cognitive assessment. You can't escape it. Now, here's G again in our battery. G is indifferent to its indicators. So it really doesn't matter what battery we've got. I could build a completely different battery with 3 new measures measuring the same domains, and I'd still get G. So you can't escape that. And furthermore, this means that the memory part of this memory test isn't here. It's not what the memory test shares with the executive test. Memory is what's unique about this test. So it's up here in the measurement error. Relative to G, memory, this domain-specific cognitive variance, the face validity of this test is up here, because they're all G tests, right? And so you don't want to forget that really only a piece of every test you use is what it purports to measure. And there's some other part, which is G, and a third part, which is measurement error, right? And this is a common problem of every psychometric measure, no matter what it purports to measure. So we can ask the empirical question, which compartment do you think is explaining the variance in dementia? I mean, is it really like the DSM says, memory, executive function, whatever? Because that's not all that those tests measure. Might it also be G? When was the last time you even thought about G in your clinical exam? What is the variance in your patient's presentation attributable specifically to G and not to memory, language, executive function, or whatever? But we just don't think about it. Maybe it's both. Maybe dementia is related to both of these. Or maybe it's neither. It's a completely empirical question. We can build a model and answer it. So that brings us to D, the cognitive correlates of functional status. That, I kind of, in retrospect, I think has been the arc of my career. I've been trying to figure out what are the cognitive determinants of functional outcomes. And I think that's the geriatrician in me. Because the truth is, psychiatrists, psychologists, neurologists hardly ever think about functional status. The DSM has a little functional status index at the bottom of it, but it's a very confused thing. The people who really seriously take functional status as something to be studied empirically are generally geriatricians and rehabilitation specialists. And I think out of that background, that's influenced the way I've been looking at psychiatry. It's my geriatric background. What is exactly the cognitive correlates of your ability to sign an advance directive, manage your medications, drive a car, live independently, make a meal? And those are questions that are relatively rare in our field. So I've had certain assumptions. First of all, cognitive impairment is insufficient to diagnose dementia. There are all sorts of cognitively impaired people who are not demented. And they're not demented because you also got to be disabled. But furthermore, they got to be related. The disability has to be due to the cognitive impairment. To the extent that you have disability not related to your cognitive functions, then again, you're not demented even though you're disabled. So I like to talk about my cousin. I have a cousin with cerebral palsy who has never walked, has never talked, and is incontinent. So he's very disabled. But he graduated valedictorian from his high school, went to LSU on a scholarship, became a computer programmer, makes more money than I do, and pays people to come to work and change his diapers. Right? That's because he's not demented. See? And the fact that he's aphasic is essentially irrelevant. So this implies that cognitive impairments that do not explain variance in functional outcomes cannot claim to be essential to a dementing syndrome. So while it might be true that a disease like Alzheimer's destroys memory and causes all sorts of cognitive impairments, not all of those cognitive impairments are related to your dementia status. And there are other dementias outside of Alzheimer's that might dement you with a completely different psychometric phenotype, but you're nonetheless demented. So if we're going to find the essential features of dementia, we have to drill down on those that actually predict functional outcomes. And I did this review in 2007 that just changed all my thinking on that. And so this was an attempt to find what those cognitive correlates are, and back in 2007 I was thinking it's going to be executive function. So that's what I was looking for. But we reviewed 68 papers offering 156 different multivariate regression models, and we were looking for the cognitive predictors in a multiply adjusted regression model of any functional outcome. So any cognitive correlate of any functional outcome. And first of all, like I said, psychiatrists generally don't put functional status in their models. So there weren't that many models where there was any functional outcome in the model. But of the ones that were there, we had 812 unique associations. Those would be partial correlations between a specific cognitive predictor and its functional outcome in a multivariate model. So, it's an empirical question. How much variance do you think cognition explains? For instance, memory. How much variance in instrumental activities of daily living do you think a memory test explains on average? It was 1.9%. 1.9% of your functional status is specifically attributable to performance on any one of 35 memory tests. Just pick one. And so, are you going to insist that memory loss is essential to dementia if it explains less than 2% of the variance? Well, what about executive function? My hypothesis was that executive function was going to do it, and I was right. 3 times more variance was attributable to executive function than memory. Are you going to go to court and swear on a stack of Bibles that after this exhaustive cognitive assessment, your patient has memory loss and executive impairment, which satisfies the DSM's definition of dementia? Are you going to swear that he can or cannot sign an advance directive with a model that in its aggregate can explain 7 or 8 or 12% of the variance in ideal? Because that's what we do every day. That's essentially what comes empirically out of our current approach. What about general cognition? You know, tests like the mini mental, or, you know, they get poo-pooed, the slums, the MOCA. There's not enough of any one thing and not much if all the other things combined. Well, they actually were better predictors against what I would have thought. They emerged as some of the strongest predictors. Of course, my test, the exit, was individually one of the strongest. But even the exit, on average, only explained 25% of variance in IADL. And that still doesn't seem like very much to me. So, and this is what I wrote. I said, these findings appear to leave us on the horns of a dilemma. Either cognition is not strongly related to functional status as we thought. In that case, there is no such thing as dementia. And we're fooling ourselves. It doesn't exist. Or something is out there and we just don't know how to measure it. We don't know what it is and it's not entering our thinking. And I started thinking about it as dark variance. Where is the dark variance in functional status? And so eventually, through my collaborator, Ray Palmer, I stumbled into these structural equation models, and we had the data sets lying around to play with. So we started to build these models. And, you know, we might end up building a model of G here. So here's a battery of tests. You don't even have to know what they are, but basically this is the Air Force Village. So this is 600 non-institutionalized 80-year-olds in a single retirement community. And this is cross-sectional data from baseline testing. And this battery would take us about an hour or an hour and a half to administer. And by their powers combined, this entire battery would build you G, and G would correlate 0.4 with functional status. That means after this entire assessment, all you could explain is 16% of the variance in functional status. A tiny fraction. And the rest is residual to that. Where is it? What's going on here? Because look, this is vocabulary similarities, block design, attention, verbal fluency, vocabulary, and verbal memory. And despite that entire assessment, I could only explain 16, 15% of the variance. So one day, it occurred to me to just do this little trick. This is the same measures. These are the same exact measures. The same battery, same subjects. All we did was take functional status, and instead of trying to predict it, I made it the indicator of a second latent variable. Now, the difference between G prime here, because it's not G anymore, now it's what's left of G after you take dementia, D, out. So it parses G into 2 pieces. G prime, what's left over, and D. And the only difference is D is allowed to be indicated by functional status, whereas the other one is not. And so what this does, essentially, is divide the variance in this battery into the fraction related to functional status and the fraction not related to functional status. And now, D correlates 0.5 with IDL and explains 25% of its variance. I doubled the amount of variance I can explain by doing this little trick. And it's nothing more than that, it's just a little trick. This is called a confirmatory factor analysis, where we're specifying that there are 2 factors here, not just 1. And actually, every time I build D, the model fits better than if I say there's only G. Right? As long as there's functional status in there. Then I can create a D, I think of them as homologs. No 2 are alike, every battery is slightly different, every functional status measure is slightly different. But in some avatar in the sky, there is an abstract concept called D, and it's a property of brain function. It is the cognitive correlates of functional status put in a bottle. And now that I have it here, I can get its biomarkers, I can image it, I can play with it, I can test its validity. you can do anything you want except measure it directly because it's a latent variable. Right? And D doesn't really represent much. It doesn't account for much of the variance in a battery. Most of the variance in a battery is what's left of Spearman's G, or residual variance, which is essentially the measurement error. And this is how relatively big measurement error is as a problem in psychometric assessment. So it's like finding a needle in a haystack. And that's why the raw test scores never predict functional status as well as sucking D out. Because by taking D out, I'm throwing away this irrelevant variance, which has nothing to do with functional status, and therefore nothing to do with dementia status. And so D represents this small fraction. You can't measure it directly. Most cognitive performance is actually irrelevant to dementia because it's measurement error or G prime and therefore not related to functional status. And that means that D must be specifically related to dementia status because that's what dementia is. It's the cognitive correlates of being disabled. So we ran off to another data set we had, which you should know about, the TARC, the Texas Alzheimer's Research and Care Consortium, because this is funded by the state of Texas and is an amazing asset available to investigators in Texas. So pretty soon you'll be able to submit proposals for pilot studies and things and get access to TARC's data, and it's paid for by the legislature. And it's a longitudinal study of now around 20, I would say it's even higher now, maybe 2,500 subjects. 30% are Mexican American. We have comprehensive psychometrics. We have expert consensus clinical diagnoses, up to 5 annual waves of follow-up, a GWAS panel, which means we have every gene ever made, and 150 serum protein biomarkers at your disposal for secondary data analyses related to dementia, depression, all sorts of things. So we built this model in TARC, and in the beginning we didn't know what the limits of this were, so we just throw everything in there. So here's a pretty detailed psychometric assessment. These are items. These are instrumental activities of daily living like shopping and cooking and doing your finances. And these are basic activities like dressing and bathing and things like that. And so I create a latent variable called F for function and another one called G for general cognition, and regress them onto the CDR, which is a state-of-the-art dementia severity rating that has to be rated by an expert clinician after interviewing the patient, the informant, and looking over the entire psychometric battery at their disposal. And so they rate how severe the dementia is. And sure enough, G and F are each strongly related to CDR scores and explain a lot of its variance. But this is not dementia because you didn't show that the variance in functional status was related to cognition. This is just cognition and functional status competing as independent predictors of dementia severity. So that's not what dementia is. So let's introduce D. Now it's the very same battery, but we've added a third latent variable D. D robs G of its association with CDR. Now this is greatly weakened, and look how strong D is. D correlates 0.9 with dementia severity. And F has been relatively weakened, but this is still significant. That's got to be biased. That's clinician bias, because that means the clinician's impression of dementia severity was informed by the variance in functional status not related to cognition. That means the TARC clinicians are biased, and you can demonstrate it empirically then. But D becomes very strongly related, and here's the mini-mental. D is strongly related to the mini-mental. Notice that clinicians are not biased by functional status when they rate the mini-mental score. It has no association with the mini-mental. And here is what's called an ROC curve, a receiver operating curve. And this is how you can statistically test the accuracy of a diagnostic test or marker. And it's varying the sensitivity and specificity for the dichotomous state, disease, no disease, across the entire range of potential cut points. And a perfect test would be a square and would explain 100% of the area here. And flipping a coin would be 50-50, and you'd have a diagonal line. So you can just see that D is almost perfect with an ROC of 0.999 in TARC to distinguish controls from Alzheimer's cases. So the D score is perfect, essentially, in this cohort. F, because of its bias, is also actually pretty good. But it shouldn't be. F is the variance in functional status not related to cognition. See? And so this again reveals the bias of the TARC clinicians. G prime, which is most of the variance in the battery, is the variance in general intelligence not related to functional status, and it's just about as good. Knowing the G prime score is just about as good as flipping a coin. You might as well flip a coin. And that means that a big chunk of cognitive performance data has nothing to do with the clinician's impression of who has Alzheimer's in this cohort. That's TARC. This is a completely different data set. D, like G, is different to its indicators. So I can just go to any existing cohort and build D if it has measures of cognition and measures of functional status. So this is the University of Kansas's Alzheimer's Center, the Brain Aging Project. D's area under the curve is 0.995, again, almost a perfect square. G is diagonal, just like in TARC. F now is better. So the Kansas boys are not biased by functional status unrelated cognition. They did probably a better job than TARC. You can see it here. Here's a more difficult discrimination. Controls versus MCI. People are struggling. How are we going to diagnose preclinical dementia in people? Because we have some indication that the interventions against Alzheimer's might do better the earlier that we could apply them, but then the problem is going to be, how are you going to diagnose dementia in the absence of dementia, right? So it becomes a logistical problem, and everybody's looking for psychometric ways to tackle that. Well, D has an area under the curve of 0.9 for this very difficult discrimination. When does MCI start? And you're no longer normal, right? That's a much more difficult distinction than the previous slide where it was just, do they have Alzheimer's or are they normal, right? And here's MCI versus Alzheimer's. That's also a difficult one. Here's the distribution for G scores. Now these latent variables can be output as a score, a factor score, essentially. And it's a bit of a pain to calculate, but basically you can rank order then, you get a continuous measure, you could rank order everybody in the room for this latent variable and where they are on it. So here's G's distribution, but it's unrelated to your dementia status, right? So you get a nice normal distribution in TARC. But this is D's distribution, because D is telling you that TARC is not a population-based cohort, it's a convenience sample. And embedded in it are only two kinds of guys, demented guys and normals. And so D's distribution is bimodal, because it is accurately telling you who's a case and who's a control. G, which is the majority of variance in TARC's cognitive battery, is totally agnostic as to whether you're demented or control. It doesn't even know there's two groups in there. You see? So this approach has really distilled the cognitive performance down to the piece that is essential to a clinician's impression of whether you're demented or not. And our approach has just been recently validated by an independent group in Colorado using a data set called the NAC, the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center. That's every patient who's ever been seen in an Alzheimer's center in the United States since the beginning of the Alzheimer's Center programs by the NIA about a decade ago. So this is close to 26,000 cases examined by experts in Alzheimer's centers all around the country and put into a common data set and made available for secondary data analyses. So this guy in Colorado read my paper evidently and built D out of this is their battery, and here's their single functional status measure, the FAQ, which we don't use. So this is not only a different battery, a different population, but a different functional status measure. Still, you can abstract out of it D, the latent variable D, and G prime. And it's also interesting to note here that this sample is composed of a bunch of different dementias, not just Alzheimer's. TARC is highly selected on Alzheimer's disease, but the NAC is just all sorts of dimensions. And here's D's ROC in the NAC. It has an ROC of 0.97 or 0.96 to diagnose dementia regardless of its etiology in the NAC and distinguish it from the control groups. Here's G prime's ROC, and again, it's exactly like in the TARC. It's just as good as flipping a coin. So we're going to throw all that variance away and concentrate on this. D here, you can see correlate, it explains 65% of the variance now in the functional status, which is huge. Remember, an entire battery might normally give you 15 or 20% of variance because it would contain this irrelevant variance, which has nothing to do with functional status and therefore dementia status. Also, he went a little step past this by building this, which is a longitudinal growth curve model of change in D over time, over 6 years, 6 waves of follow-up in the NAC, as a predictor of change in dementia severity over the same 6 years. And the intercepts of these two growth curves are strongly related cross-sectionally at 0.93, and longitudinally, the slope of change in D correlates 0.94 with the slope of change in dementia severity in 26,000 people across multiple dementing illnesses. So they have different rates of progression. Vascular, FTD, Alzheimer's, they have different ways that these diseases eat the brain and affect their cognitive performance. But buried within all of that variability is the change these diseases affect in the D-score, and that change is driving the change in the clinician's estimate of the dementia severity. So D accurately distinguishes dementia from controls regardless of the disease process involved, and it's strongly related with dementia severity cross-sectionally and longitudinally. So this gives us a continuously varying dementia phenotype now. The D-score becomes a measure of your dementia severity, and because it's continuous, I could rank order every individual in this room for how demented they are, even though a clinician might call you all controls. Still, there's variability, and Dr. Stedman's holding it together here. So he'd still be there. But, even Aggies can be rank ordered for how demented they are through this metric. And then we can use clinicians to find the thresholds for where quantitatively now normal stops and MCI begins, MCI stops and dementia begins, and it's completely empirically quantifiable. And then we can find the biomarkers using parametric statistical methods, because we're not reduced to just throwing everybody in a bag and calling them Alzheimer's and here are the controls and let's find the biomarkers of that discrimination. Now we can rank order everybody in the room and find the biomarkers of that, which means you can do it much more efficiently with better statistical methods that are more flexible and with better power. So you need smaller sample size. So, and these associations with dementia appear to be so strong across multiple data sets that maybe we can put the clinician out of the business. Because essentially what I'm saying is that nobody has dared diagnose dementia purely from psychometric measures before. Even psychologists interview the patient when they examine them. And nobody would just look at the numbers blind to who the patient was and try to diagnose their dementia status that way. It can't be done. And so you need right now a clinician to do the voodoo, right? And the clinicians, what do they know about numbers? They don't even look at the numbers, right? But they know what dementia is. They just say, well, look at him. I mean, just look at him, he's demented. But they can't internalize what they're doing. They don't really know. Well, I just look at him and I know he's demented, right? And then you play some fiction with the numbers. You go, well, it's because this was up and that was down and this was over here. That's why he's demented. But still, that means that you got to go to clinic to get a definitive diagnosis. And that means you can't live in West Texas in a trailer, right? Because you're 5 hours from Van Horn. And what clinician is going to be in Van Horn who can diagnose dementia? You see, he's got to be an Aggie. And then you're back in the hole again. So what this does potentially is liberate us from case finding in a clinic. We can now develop a diagnosis completely through other means, the internet or a phone app, that would put the clinician out of the loop and empirically diagnose you with an ROC of 0.99 versus somebody from the NAC, so that's Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic, right? And you'd never have to leave your trailer home in West Texas. And because it's measurement error free, we could do it in Spanish or English at your pleasure, right? Because the latent variable is going to be free of measurement error. So here's just an example of how this might work. This is a data set that happens to be in Japan, okay? And these guys in Japan were validating my tests, the exit and the clocks. So that's how I got a hold of this data. And so the first thing I did was build a multivariate regression model of this battery of tests to predict dementia severity. Now, what's interesting about this data set is that the dementia severity was rated blindly to the cognitive assessment. So the clinicians doing this didn't have access to these test scores. And here's functional status. And this is essentially a multivariate regression model. And the mini-mental is the strongest predictor of both IDL and CDR in this data set, right? But the fit is not great. And all of this mess out here to get this not great fit suggests the existence of a latent variable that this model does not account for. There's something else out there, or you wouldn't have to put all these correlations in. Because in a structural equation model, you have to account for 100% of the variance or it won't run, right? And if it doesn't fit, then that means there's something else out there. So you take the very same variables and rearrange them to create D, and now the fit is much better. So the model really likes that. And D correlates 0.9 with the CDR score. 0.9, because it is dementia. Even though now D is developed from cognitive testing that was obtained completely blindly to the CDR score. So every time I build this, it's the first time it's ever been done with those measures, so I got to revalidate it. So all I'm doing here is just revalidating in Japanese translation the D construct. And you get this distribution in their data set, right? They have MCI mixed in, so it's a continuous distribution instead of a bimodal one. And through ROC, I can find point A is the best place to put your threshold down to distinguish Alzheimer's from MCI, and B is the best place to set the threshold from normal controls to MCI, and that means MCI has got to be in the middle, right? And ROC is great. And so basically, we could build this into a D meter, the phone app of the future, which we don't got yet. But it would be a D meter. It would look like this. You get your application on the phone, and it would just say, what test you got, right? And each one of these would be selected from batteries that we had already, models we had already built and coded into the software. So you'd have some cognitive tests, and you have some functional status, and in your clinic, maybe you got this test, that test, and this functional status measure, and we would match it to a model, and we would say, here's the model that those tests matched, here's where it was published, here's its validity, and by the way, these are real numbers from real D models. And here's its fit. Do you want to use that model? You want to go with that one? And you say yes. So it says, okay, give me your first test. Put the raw score in. Give me your second test. Give me your third test. By the way, these 3 tests could be given over the phone. So this would be a model that you could do with 3 tests over the telephone. You can call the caregiver on the phone. You ask her the functional status questions and put that answer in. And it would instantly calculate your D score and give you the distribution, the best thresholds, and tell you that the recommended diagnosis is dementia. Now you yourself could do it with a calculator, but it'd take you a little while, and you can't do it by looking at the raw numbers ever. See, so you'd have to have the model to inform the D score. But once you have the model, then basically it's going to equate you against this distribution of known cases in some validating cohort and assign you a dementia diagnosis. And that battery could be done over the phone in about 10 minutes, I would estimate. And we're piloting that exact model I just showed you actually right now at Air Force Village. I have lay people phoning people at Air Force Village, and then I, the gold standard, go out and test these people independently of the telephone. And then we're going to see if the D-score derived from lay people calling them up on the phone at their convenience can get an ROC greater than 0.9 against me, the expert, going out there and seeing. So here, another trick, we could use this as an outcome in clinical trials. See? So here's TARC data. This is an identity plot. So this is not a regression. This is the line of identity between baseline D-score and your D-score 1 year later from the same model. So if you had no change in your dementia status, you would map to this line of identity. And you can see that across 2,000 people in TARC followed for 1 year, not many people are on that line. Most of them have changed their D-score over a period as long as 1 year. I mean, as short as 1 year. And in TARC, we can do this 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and show you how these plots look at every wave. Anyway, if you went that way, you got worse over a year. If you went that way, you got better. And I've color-coded diagnoses. So baseline, if you were normal, you're blue, MCI is green, and Alzheimer's is sage. So you can see this nice, as your D-score gets lower, clinicians are calling you normal, MCI, AD. You can just pick your D-score where you want to transition and make the diagnosis that way. Then over time, these are cases who converted. Yellow are normals who converted to MCI in 1 year. And red are MCI cases who converted to AD over 1 year. And so in general, you can see that as your D-score gets worse, you convert from normal to MCI to AD, and you can find where these people are. And generally, these people got worse over the year that they were followed. So the ones who converted actually got worse in their D-score. But still, even among the demented cases, some people make their D-scores get better over time. And maybe you didn't expect that in Alzheimer's, that your dementia could become better. Because we might want to cull those people out of the herd and find out, what did you do? What diet were you on? What pills did you take to have gotten better? And he's agnostic, though, about your dementia etiology. So just because the clinician said you were Alzheimer's at autopsy, that's not always true. Most brains have multiple dementing pathologies at autopsy. So it may be as simple as you were depressed at time 1, and that affects your D-score too. And as your depression got better, you became less demented, you see? And so this Alzheimer's case got better. And maybe we should be offering antidepressant treatment to treat incident dementia conversions. Because we don't got analog drugs right now. What else are you going to do? Right? And it's just an empirical question. Does antidepressant treatment improve D-scores? And we have reason to think it might. So these are different D homologs in different data sets to show you that it really doesn't matter what measures you got. This phenomenon is independent of which measures are available, and we can exploit that. So in general, D is better than the sum of its parts. The D-score is always a more accurate diagnostic marker than any of the raw tests that go into it. So here's data from TARC. This is the model. And here's the ROCs of all the individual tests. And you can see here that these IQ tests, logical memory and visual recall, approximate D. And that's literally true. The stronger their correlation with D, then the more accurate their ROC is. So in a sense, if you had these tests, you wouldn't necessarily need to go through the trouble of building D and using the phone app, right? But the problem is, these take a highly skilled psychometrician, ideally a PhD neuropsychologist to do, and that constrains where you can get this testing done and your diagnosis. Whereas D can be built from anything you got. So it doesn't have to be that complicated. In the beginning, we built models like these because we didn't know what to put in there, what to leave out, so we just put everything in. And you get Ds that correlate very strongly with dementia severity here. But then we realized pretty soon we didn't need all those tests. We could cherry pick whichever ones we want for any other agenda. And so here, these tests, it's a much smaller battery. And now it's even smaller, and each one of these can be given over the phone. and you get a D that correlates 0.9 with dementia severity. And here's where we're down to just the mini-mental and clocks. I mean, that's 3 minutes of testing that my medical student can do at the bedside. But I get a D that correlates 0.93 with CDR sum of boxes and has an ROC better than any of the individual tests in this data set. And the reason we wanted to use these is because we wanted to extrapolate the D-score to a population-based cohort of Mexican Americans called the Hispanic Epidemiological Study of, epidemiological population in the elderly, well, the easy study. And, but the thing is, with most epidemiological studies, they may have thousands of people in really interesting data sets, longitudinal follow-up, but the one thing they don't have are formal psychometrics and a visit to the neurologist to get your diagnosis. So they don't have any diagnoses to associate all those wonderful variables with. But we think that the D-score could accomplish that. And we can accomplish it with whatever psychometric testing they happen to have at the bedside, even if it's as little as the mini-mental and clock drawing. And so sure enough, you can build D out of just a few IDL items, mini-mental and clock drawing. It has a very accurate ROC, and you can extrapolate it to the entire easy cohort. And then we did the same trick again, this time radically across boundaries. We took this battery in TARC, which contains, again, the mini-mental and clocks, and exported it to Japan. Because the Japanese guys, they have a data set, but all they had that overlapped with TARC was the mini-mental and clocks. Those are the only cognitive measures that were common to the 2 data sets. And we're extrapolating them now across language and cultural and translation. And so we build it in half the TARC cases. That's the validation cohort. This is just 1,000. We reserve the other 1,000 to test the validation, to test the model. So we built it here, we validated it there, and this is the entire D homolog that we built. And then this other variable, T2J, Texas to Japan, is just the factor weights from this big model, just the factor weights of these 3 tests. So we're going to use the big model to inform the factor weights of the tests that overlap the 2 data sets, and just take those factor weights to Japan. And you can see it has a decent ROC. Here's 1,000, here's the other 1,000, and then in Japan we didn't have this measure, we have this one. So here's the correlation with the CDR in the initial validation of the big model, its replication, the initial validation of the restricted model, its replication, and then its exportation to Japanese data. And here's the ROCs, and again, in every case, the performance of the restricted construct in Japan is psychometrically identical to in Texas. So we can export that. And here's another attempt for a grant I just wrote. What we're going to try to do is build 1D homolog and standardize dementia assessment across multiple epidemiological studies that share a common psychometric battery in different languages, China, Japan, India, wherever. And so to show we could do it, we built D in Irishman in the Irish longitudinal study of aging, and we exported it to Japanese data. T is the model in Japan using factor weights derived from Irishman. J is the D homolog built in Japan with Japanese data. And you can see that Irish exported factor weights are identical in their ROC to the Japanese factor weights. So we can build it in one culture and export it across culture. And this is for the more difficult discrimination of Alzheimer's versus everything. It's just dementia versus not. And we get an ROC of 0.9 for that. So what we can do is now classify people in Japan or in Tilda, going the other way, for having clinical dementia or not, even though none of them ever went to go see a doctor. And you'd have an ROC somewhere close to 0.9, which is awfully good. Better than any biomarker currently in the literature, any blood test or brain imaging biomarker. They don't achieve ROCs this strong generally. And we can get these biomarkers. So I showed you this 3 years ago. It wasn't published yet, but you've seen this data. So here's the D model we built in Kansas because they had imaging data. TARC doesn't have any imaging data. And so we associated the D score with atrophy, and it turns out that the atrophy in the brain related to D maps to what's called the default mode network. Here are the hubs of the default mode network, and they correspond to the regions of the brain whose atrophy is related specifically to your D score. So dementia has a home in the brain, and that home is the default mode network. Because just like most cognitive performance is unrelated to dementia and functional status, most brain atrophy is in fact unrelated to functional status and therefore dementia. And the default mode network is interesting because it's a network of connected regions of interest that share a very peculiar activation pattern. They're turned on at rest and between cognitive tasks and turned off during specific task processing. And this helps explain why D explains so little variance in cognition, because as soon as a psychologist asks you a question, your default mode network turns off. And some part of the brain unrelated to IDL turns on to answer your question. Who's the President of the United States? What's 5 times 12? What day of the week is it? As soon as a psychologist asks you a question, you're not using the part of the brain connected to dementia. And that's why cognitive testing, I think, is so relatively weak in predicting functional status and dementia status when you look at the raw observed scores. So through the magic of mathematics, they can extract, from the brain scan these connectivity, and the most connected regions are the hubs of the default mode network. And you can then take these hubs in the abstract and map them back into the raw imaging data, and you can see where the regions that are connected to the default mode network. And what you'll be able to see from the back of the room, I think, is the posterior cingulate and precuneus here. So you can see that from the back. This is where the brain amyloid is deposited. And I want you to notice it's not random, it's the same network. Amyloid in the brain isn't randomly growing on it like mushrooms. It's specifically implicating the default mode network, which is the key region of the brain whose atrophy is related to the D score, which is the only variance in cognition related to functional status and is strongly accurate in predicting a clinician's impression of your dementia status. And that may be why Alzheimer's is a dementing illness. Because if it affected other brain regions and not the default mode network, you'd be handicapped by your memory loss, but you would not be demented because you would still do what needs to be done about your memory loss. And you'd pay the guy to change your diapers at work, you see, instead of just sitting around ruminating about it. So another trick we can do, and I have Ram Vishnoi working on this with me, is these are called mimic models. Remember, TARC has 150 serum proteins, and a lot of them are supposedly markers of inflammation, and maybe inflammation is doing something to the brain. So we can test that. We can take a cognitive battery, and instead of trying to find the serum biomarkers related to performance on some test, we can divide the variance into D and G prime and see specifically, is this a dementing biomarker? Because if this biomarker is related to dementia, it will have a significant effect on D. But if it's merely related to cognitive performance and not dementia, it'll have an effect through this path or directly, independently of these two latent variables. So the mimic model conveniently tests all of that simultaneously. And I have 150 serum proteins. So we've built all of these models. 71 of these proteins are associated with cognition through D and are therefore potentially either dementing or protecting you from dementia, depending on the association, if it's positive or negative. So 71 are related to D. Most of those effects are weak, but several had pretty significant partial correlations. So what that would mean is you're not going to cure dementia by working on these biomarkers, but I could see chemotherapy in the future where you take the top 5 and modulate those 5 serum proteins, and in their aggregate, that might push your D score towards normal, right? And who cares whatever else it did in the brain? So 36 of those 71 had protective effects on D, and maybe we could augment them and treat your D score that way. But 6 of those 36 had adverse effects on G prime. Think what that would mean to the FDA. You would be less demented while dementia got worse, right? While cognitive performance got worse. But regardless, the cognitive performance would be getting worse in the fraction of variance that has nothing to do with whether you're demented. It would be getting better in the fraction that would be related to your actual functional status. And we see patients like this, I think, all the time. You have people where the test scores are worse today, but just look at him, he's better. And conversely, we have people we know are worse, even though the test scores look better today, and so we ignore them. That happens every day in clinic. 35 of these proteins had adverse effects, and so I could undermine them. I could find antibodies. So these are potential therapeutic targets we're identifying. Proteins that are specifically associated with your dementia status through the mimic analysis. And finally, I think D can take us past cognitive assessment, ways we're just really not thinking about yet. For instance, I started my whole career thinking executive function was the cognitive correlates of functional status. Well, now I got D. Is D the same thing as executive function? Does executive function even exist independently of D? And I just looked at this recently. I'm going to show you 4 models with the very same indicators. So it's the same observed data, but each model I show you has better and better and better fit, and so it's closer to the truth. So we could take this battery, which has intentionally some memory tests and some executive tests, and we can use them to predict functional status, adjusted for age, education, and gender. And this entire battery here, about an hour and a half worth of testing, explains 24% of the variance in IDL, including the covariance here. So that's not real exciting. 24% of the variance, and that's assuming you also know the age and education and gender of the person. So let's build latent variables. We'll reorganize the same data. Here's memory, here's executive function. Executive function correlates much stronger with IDL than memory. Memory is significant, but relatively weak, 0.17. I don't know if you can see that from the back. Executive function is 0.34. This is a model like I might have built in the 90s, where I got executive function competing against memory to predict functional status. And the model has better fit, but it's not perfect. And it doesn't acknowledge the existence of G, which Spearman told us at the very beginning of psychology, we should be all over. G is important, and we're ignoring it. There's no G in here, but it exists. So let's put it in the model, and the model fits much better now. It loves it. But as soon as I put G in, executive function dies, and is no longer, I can't keep executive function in the model. That latent variable has been eaten up by G. And that's what Duncan was telling us recently, that G, its variance, relates to the frontal lobe and executive function. So that's great, and now G correlates 0.4 with IDL and has taken over the variance. It robbed memory of a little bit, right? Because some of these memory tests, look, they load significantly on G. These aren't all strictly memory tests. They're also G tests. And now G has robbed that variance and left only a little bit for memory to play with. And what's left in memory really has nothing to do with IDL. So now it's all over here with G, but that doesn't accommodate D. So now we split G into D. This model fits even better than the previous ones. And now D correlates 0.65 with IDL and explains 55% of its variance. So this is where executive function lives. What I've always been thinking of as executive function, the cognitive correlates of functional status, is actually D, and it lives not in the frontal lobe, but in the default mode network, which has a little piece of the frontal lobe, but most of the frontal lobe is not in the default mode network. And similarly, here, look at the Wisconsin card sort. It has no significant association with D. It's a frontal lobe test, but its variance is related to G prime, which has absolutely nothing to do with functional status. So there's no path from the Wisconsin card sort to IDL. And that means that even though it may be true that monkeys can sort cards and that their performance on that task goes to the frontal lobe, that in fact has nothing to do with D and therefore nothing to do with dementia, because it has nothing to do with functional status. You see? And that's what this allows us to do, is divorce frontal functions in general from dementing functions, which may depend a little bit on the frontal lobe and its substrate, but not the whole damn thing. And most so-called frontal tests may actually have nothing to do with functional outcomes. So who cares if your wonder drug makes trails making better? Trail making is in the same boat. The exit is what loads up D, and that's why it's always been such a good measure of functional status relative. So I'm not so sure executive function exists anymore, at least the way I was thinking about it. And these classical so-called frontal lobe tests, I say so-called because I remember before they were executive tests, when nobody talked about executive function, and so these were attention tests. They weren't executive until recently. And then we reinvented them as executive tests, and now maybe I'm going to trash that conceptualization, and they'll just become frontal tests. They're not necessarily executive. And you got to remember, G is a piece of everything. So how far can we go down with this? Spearman took it down to sensory functions. These D models are made out of items. I'm treating individual items on a single test as though they were a battery of tests. I'm taking Spearman at his word that these are cognitive measures. So even the items are cognitive functions. And I can get D built from just 5 items on the 15-item clock scale that correlates 0.92 with an expert's blind opinion of the severity of your dementia status. And now I have it down to just 5 items off a 10-second clock drawing test. And here are 5 items taken off the exit, but they're not random exit items. They're items you can give over the phone. So you can't give the whole exit over the phone, but you can give these 5 items over the phone, and that creates D-texes, which correlates 0.8 with dementia severity, just over the phone. And this gives me a new appreciation for the silly mini-mental, because these general tests like the mini-mental, the slums, the MOCA, they look trivial, but if you can build D out of items, then they're a battery. And they're so comprehensive, memory, orientation, language, drawing abilities, they're so comprehensive, they're a good proxy for G, and buried in G is the little piece that's D. So even though they might not be as good as D homolog constructed from the very same items, still, in their aggregate, they outperform the Wisconsin card sort, or formal tests. Because the formal tests drill down into one cognitive function, and by doing that, they're getting further and further away from G, and therefore D. You see? So very expensive formal tests are going to be weaker predictors of dementia than the general ones that anybody can do at bedside. And so the mini-mental's area under the curve for the diagnosis of dementia is actually relatively strong. It's embarrassing to the biomarker people because nobody has got a CSF biomarker as good as the mini-mental. It doesn't exist. And the mini-mental, hell, anybody can do that, right? So why do you need the fancy CSF biomarker? And so they don't like to report that very much, but the biomarkers are not nearly as good as silly bedside 2-minute exams. So I'm thinking G, and therefore D, must be something really, really deep in the brain because it goes all the way down to items, it's across batteries, it's across multiple cohorts. And Spearman, when I read his paper, I was shocked to find that he built G out of nothing more than sensory discrimination tasks. Like, here's a color, here's another color. You think they're the same or different? Different. You're intelligent, right? Spearman showed that G, built from tasks like that, correlates perfectly with G constructed from formal assessments of your high school professor of your ability to do math, science, French, Latin, things like that. And so basically, your intelligence goes down at least to the quality of your sensory discriminations. How about that? You think those are the same or different? I think they're different. But basically, he was looking at very subtle sensory discrimination tasks. And that's what he constructed G out of as a demonstration of how deep in the brain G extends. What biology does that suggest? What could be so deep in brain function that it applies equally to the Wisconsin card sort and to whether you can tell two colors apart? I mean, you think that's the hippocampus? Yeah? Is that the basal ganglia? Where in the brain would that something that broad be? And he remarked on this. He said the central function, G, whatever it is hardly anywhere more prominent than in the simple act of discriminating two nearly identical tones. He had tuning forks tuned to slightly different keys. Or we arrive at the remarkable result that the common and essential element in intelligence wholly coincides with the common, and he means the shared variance in a mathematical factor analysis, element across sensory functions. So, and he published that in 1904 when Teddy Roosevelt was president and Russia was at war with Japan and Siberia, right? And we don't even talk about G these days. And yet there it is just sitting there. What brains must do. Brains do a whole lot more than sensory discrimination tests. Brains do all of this stuff too. This is completely empirical. Guess which of these have been associated in the last few years with Alzheimer's disease? All of them, right? So I'm seeing a way to a completely empirical definition of dementia. I could build D out of variables like this, and then I don't even need to ask you a question. Gait speed is related to brain function and dementia. So maybe I could build D out of surveillance video of the way you walk in public and diagnose your dementia status and rank order you against everybody else in the shopping mall by the pattern of your typing on the computer screen or the way you use your credit card or the way that you walk down the mall, because that's what brains do too, and G is a part of that, and NG is D. You see? So that may be feasible. So G and D, I might be able to get it from things like this without ever asking the patient a question and without any expert evaluation or review, and achieve ROCs greater than 0.9 from just routinely available empirical behavioral data. So that's where I think I could go with this. So latent variables can be used to construct these clinically meaningful constructs that are very accurate in diagnosing dementia relative to clinicians. And because it's indifferent to its indicators, I can build it from literally everything you got. I can do it post hoc in existing data sets or prospectively in data sets engineered to achieve some other agenda. You want to do it over the telephone, in French, with social workers doing the telephone. See, no problem. We just build the battery and we get deep. And we can go down to item level and maybe build from behavioral, completely objectively available behavioral metrics that we don't even think of as cognition. Because what Spearman was talking about is not what you call being smart. It's the shared variance. It is a completely mathematical construction. And it's the shared variance across any battery of cognitive measures. So I think this puts us right back where we were in 1904. We're ready to start over again. Dementia is not memory loss. It is not executive impairment. It is not language impairment. It's hardly even cognitive performance. It's a thin sliver of cognitive performance related to general intelligence, and that changes everything. It changes how we can assess it and what its biomarkers have to be constrained to be. Because, think of stroke. All strokes, by definition, are local. So can they affect G? Is there any combination of stroke that could affect general intelligence? Or is stroke necessarily limited to memory, language, intelligence, depending on whether, executive function, depending on where the stroke lesion is, and therefore unable to predict your dementia status? And yet, we clearly know there are demented people with strokes, but if the strokes didn't cause the dementia, it begs the question of what did. Right? And so maybe the stroke is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's really some other aspect of the brain function in vascular disease. It's demented people. So this is just a new way to look at it. And it disentangles dementia from cognitive performance and opens the door to accurate case finding from just almost any easily acquired, convenient behavioral data stream. That's it. It won't let me go further.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions. So I think you've made a very compelling case that if we had cognitive measures and functional status measured, however we can estimate D. The question that I've got is, how comparable is D across different measures of what you've got that you've derived it from? You had an early slide where you sort of alluded to this latent variable being estimated across multiple data sets, but then an overall latent variable being estimated. So I'm wondering how comparable D would be across different measures of cognition and functional status.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, D has similar, not to say identical, psychometric properties in every data set we've looked at so far. So it always has an ROC greater than 0.9 for Alzheimer's versus control, regardless of what data set, what language, what measures, and in their aggregate, we've built it in maybe 5 or 6 data sets now, and several different combinations of measures. Now, in TARC, if you throw everything you got at it, the ROC is 0.999. And in Japan, when you're limited to items from a single clock drawing test, it's 0.93. So that's not quite identical. So it's suffering a little bit by constraining the database that far down. So there's going to be some practical limit on that. But on the other hand, I mean, hell, you're using 5 items off a single clock drawing test in Japanese translation and getting them on
Right.
0.93.
And you showed the Kansas data set, which used
Yeah.
a different set of measures.
Right,
But
completely
it still had
different
the
set.
same property.
Right.
So I'd be wondering
And
if you had one sample that had all of the same measures and used the Kansas subset and the TARC subset, how correlated those Ds would be?
well, I think
We're
they would
picking up
be,
something slightly different.
I would think they'd be really strongly correlated. As a matter of fact, one exercise I have in mind is to take TARC's hour and a half battery, break it into 2 random halves, build D in both those halves, and correlate them with each other.
Yeah.
D from this half of the battery, D from that.
Of course, the next question that I've got is, I saw you had GWAS data in the TARC sample of a few thousand individuals.
Right.
Have you looked at a GWAS then analysis of your D score in TARC yet?
No, that's on the agenda. That's one of the main TARC aims for this next biennium. We're going to build the GWAS. We're going to build the GWAS model of D.
We probably only have time for one more question. Dr. Stedman, any questions?
Well, I just want to say what I've learned today is not to sit on the front and hear them.
All right, thank you, Dr.
Henri qui serpent sur sa bouche. Voilà les potes sans
Are you doing them? No. Who are they? They're the state hospital. And it's down on the northeast side, right down southeast side, right? Right. Yeah, right.
Tu les jettes et ça me fait quelque chose.
Yeah, I mean, we offer credit too, more than maybe we ran around. Oh, well, thanks.
N'est pas de balle, mais je connais la
We've had 3 at the mark. Because they don't advertise So we took it there and they didn't tell me. It's the biggest appointment. This is nice to see. So it's not mandatory. They get to